Hi YouTube, I'm Andy. Welcome back to my shed. This is part 3 of my LED matrix build. In part 1 we looked at the prototype unit. In part 2 we built the backplane for a new larger unit, and in this video we're going to be building the case and the dividers. This is where my table saw lives. Now the shed's not actually big enough to cut anything up in here, so I'm going to take all of this outside and do it there. I'm using some 18mm plywood that I had left over from, in fact, when I built my shed. So I'm cutting a groove for the diffuser, and I want it to be around 4mm wide and about 5mm high. So I'm running through a little test piece here to make sure my table saw is cut to the right height. So I run it through once and I get a 2mm slot, which is the width of my blade, and then I adjust the fence to move it over by another 2mm and cut a second groove. So that will give me a groove that's 4mm wide and 5mm deep. So I'm then using a miter saw. This is set to 45 degrees so I can cut nice angles on the corners. Once you've cut one strip, you can use that to mark the length of the second strip and make sure they're exactly the same length. I'm using this iron-on edging tape to give the edges a nice finish. I've got a small miniature iron, but you can also use a regular clothes iron. We just lay the tape on top and then use the heat to soften the adhesive and some pressure to stick it down to the wood. So I'm going to paint and varnish the inside because it's much easier to do that when they're on a bench like this than when it's all put together. I need to cut some holes in this case to accommodate the mains power inlet, and also some switches I've got which I'm going to be using to select patterns and change the speed or the brightness or something, I'm not quite sure yet. And I've also got a USB pass-through connector that allows me to connect to my Arduino from the outside so I can reprogram it without having to take the whole thing apart. I created a paper template showing the positions of the holes that I need to cut these strips out, and then applied some spray mount to the back so that I could stick them onto my wood panels and hold them steady while I drilled the holes. So I start off by marking the centres and then drilling pilot holes. Now my switches aren't long enough to go all the way through this 18mm plywood, so I used a router to route out a rebate on the back that would allow the switches to sit in. I'm drilling the holes for the switches going through from both sides. If you just do it through from one side, then it has a tendency to blow out the veneer on the back as the drill punches through. For the power inlet, I started off with 4 8mm holes in the corner and then used a jigsaw to connect the holes together. To assemble the case, I started off by clamping everything together dry, that is, no glue. Then I can take one end off and slide the diffuser down the groove into the other end. I'm using PVA wood glue here on the ends. Then the end piece can be carefully attached. You might have to do a bit of jiggling to get the diffuser to sit into the slot. But then it can be clamped together, any final adjustments made, and then I use a band clamp which goes around the whole frame to hold it tight while the glue dries. Then when one end is dry, I just take the other end off and repeat the process. Then it's time to varnish the outside of the case. To strengthen the case, I'm using some metal brackets on the inside. So that completes the case, and the next job is to cut the dividers. I need 17 long ones and 23 short ones, but I want to cut one extra of each to use as a template. The dividers are 40mm wide, so I start off cutting strips of foam board on the table saw. I created this template to allow me to accurately cut the slots in the foam board dividers. I'm going to stick these pieces onto one of the strips, one long strip, one short strip. So I'll put some spray mount on the back, cut the individual pieces out, and at the ends I'm cutting diagonally across the centre line so that I can align the two pieces accurately when I stick them onto the foam board strips. So I have one long strip, one short strip, make sure all the pieces are stuck on, and then I cut them off at the correct line at the end. Then I take all the long pieces, put the template on the front, bundle them together and wrap them up in some cling film and then a little bit of extra masking tape just to hold them all tightly together so that they stay as one bundle. And then I do the same again for the short pieces. This is the jig that I made to cut the slots in the dividers. It's a variation of a cross-cut sled, and if you search on YouTube you'll find lots of videos that show you how to make them. I made mine from some strips of 12mm MDF that I had left over from the LED Matrix prototype. I drilled and countersunk the side pieces and then glued and screwed them onto the base piece. A cross-cut sled has runners on the bottom that fit into the tracks on the top of the table saw, and the idea is they should be exactly the right size so that the sled moves backwards and forwards without any side play, and this will give you a cut exactly as wide as your saw blade, which in my case is 2mm. But I need a 5mm slot, so I've made my runners 3mm too narrow so that the sled has got 3mm of movement from left to right. So I can pass through once, pushing it to the left of the track and get a 2mm slot, and then I can move it over, cut another slot, and finally push it against the right hand side to do a final cut, and that will give me a slot that's exactly 5mm wide. Cutting the runners to the right width took a little bit of trial and error. I started off with some that were a little too wide, knowing that I could always shave a bit off to bring them down to the right size. It's important that the runners are exactly square to the back and front of the sled, so I attached one screw through the runner, positioned it on the table saw, and then used my square to make sure it was perfectly square before attaching the second screw. For the second runner, I used some foam board to make sure it was properly wedged against one side of the track, and then also, as I was attaching it, pushed the sled so that the other runner was also against the same side of the track. With both runners in place, I could then make a test cut. So I cut a test slot in the bottom of the sled by passing it through the table saw several times, making sure I go left and right. And my slot was about 0.5mm too narrow, so I then shaved about 0.5mm off the width of the runners. With the runners reattached, I then flipped the sled around from left to right and cut a new slot, which turned out to be more or less exactly 5mm. So then we're ready to cut the dividers, and we load the block of dividers into the sled and make sure the lines on the template exactly match the slot on the bottom of the sled. I've also adjusted the table saw blade height so that it exactly reaches the centre line. Then I pass it through, going left, going right, and then I get a nice clean slot cut in all the dividers in one go. Then I just need to repeat it, moving the block over, lining up the next slot and cutting them till all the slots have been cut. There's a little bit of clean-up work to be done afterwards. You sometimes get some chaff left in the grooves, so I just went through and cleaned those up with a bit of sandpaper wrapped around a ruler. The front template gets chewed up by the table saw, so we don't need that anymore, we throw that away. And then we're ready to start putting the dividers together. Before fitting the backplane, I decided to add some pull tabs to the back to make it possible to get the backplane back out again if I need to for maintenance. I found some rubber feet. They were actually from an old keyboard sustain pedal I'd butchered for a previous project, and they turned out to be perfect. I also added some mounting points for the power supply. And then it's time to fit the backplane into the case. So I'm just carefully sliding it in and dropping it down onto the dividers. I've got some additional hardware to fit in the case. I've got some push buttons and also a mains power inlet. So that attaches onto the mains inlet on the power supply. And I've got some spade terminals here that have been crimped and heat shrunk. These switches have an integrated LED. I've got 4 wires coming out of each, 2 for the LED and 2 for the switch, and then these just go onto a 4-way connector which will be connecting onto a PCB later. As well as the 4 switches, I've got the USB pass-through socket which allows me to reprogram the Arduino from the outside. So now, the only thing remaining left to do is something I've been itching to do for a long time now, and that's to peel off that protective film. Here we go. So here's the finished unit. We've made the case, the dividers, and put everything together, and now it's running. There's some detail I've skipped over, for example the PCB that I'm using to connect the switches up to the Arduino, but I'm going to cover that in the next video along with details of the software that I've written to generate patterns like this. So that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.